Welcome along to this edition of Live on Air this evening from Trinity-at-Waiake, the Learning Centre. I'm delighted to have with me again Laurinda Erasmus. Laurinda is an author of no mean repute, and we're going to be talking about one of her award-winning books this evening. But let me just hold this book up so that folk can see it.
Right. It's quite a long title, but it's Benessere Well-Being, and it is a vegan and sugar-free eating for a healthy lifestyle. Benessere just means well-being, so I just repeated that part in the title. Yes, when I went vegan, I went to a lot of bookshops and I wanted to know more about cooking. I'm quite creative in the kitchen. I don't just want to put a meal together. I'd like to have it fantastic, nice tasting, colourful textures and everything. And then I was disappointed to see there was actually very few and almost no vegan recipe books on the shelves. A few that was bound with ring binding, believe it or not, for sale in some bookshops. That was certainly not good enough for me. So after looking around at a few bookshops in New Zealand, United States as well as the UK, all three countries, I decided, well, why not put something together myself? So that was the starting point.
It's a very unique book. We know that because of your research trying to find vegan recipes, etc. But it's also it's actually a huge book in terms of the number of recipes that are available there. Tell us just a little bit about how did you get into the vegan lifestyle in the first place, Laurinda?
I was always very interested in health, well-being, the whole spectrum, but specifically also nutritionally. So I did a lot of research, right up to cell level, in terms of what happens, eating various foods, the peptides, proteins, ions, what type of ions, heme and non-heme, that sort of thing. And then I wanted to, for myself, also for family, create recipes, meals, meal plans, a whole nutritional plan almost, that is nutritionally sound and balanced, that sort of thing. So it was a lot of research behind the scenes of plant nutrition per se as well. Even different types of zinc. You get, for instance, zinc that's not so bioavailable sometimes in plant as an animal, but then you make other connections in terms of how to eat certain foods together to make things more bioavailable for your body. So, so before I even put the recipes together, I already had that knowledge as well.
So what we're seeing by the time we start talking about the books and book production itself, there's an incredible amount of research and thinking that's gone in before you had even considered writing a book about it.
That's right, that's right, yes. So way before one gets to the creative process, I think it's very important to do some research into your subject, you know your subject very well, and then once the creation, when you start your project, then to know exactly what you're doing there, and then right up to the point of marketing as well. So it's quite a long road, but very exciting. It's very good to do.
It is a long road. It's not just from A to E, it's from A to Z. It's go to woe kind of thing.
That's right, yes, exactly. Because I put some recipes together and then creating, it's quite a thick book. So there's 525 recipes about in there. And then I approached some publishers as well and got turned down by two. And I thought this could probably be going on for a while and wasting a lot of time. In the meantime, some other vegan recipe books may appear on the shelves and I might just lose out on that opportunity as well. So after just two that turned me down in terms of unknown author and small niche market, which exactly it is, which is in fact my attraction to that. I like it to be in a small niche market. I just decided to do it myself.
Well, I think that's absolutely incredible. And by doing it yourself, in no sense did you lose out because you weren't going through a known publisher. This book went on to collect an award.
That's right.
And tell us a little bit about that.
That's right. So that happened basically in the time when I did my marketing part of the book, because I approached a lot of libraries, booksellers, book fairs, that sort of thing as well. And then it was picked up by one of the companies that I should enter my book for the Living Now Book Awards that's in New York. And I entered that, and in that section of cookery and natural foods, I won a gold medal for that.
A very well-deserved gold medal. The book is just fantastic. It's a treasure trove of information and recipes. But what I'd like to do this evening, Laurinda, is to talk about the creative process. And there may be some people that watch this that think, how do I get started? You know, what's really involved in writing a book? Do I have a book within me? Not necessarily in the recipes niche, or you know, but their own niche. And we're going to explore that. But it might be quite helpful if you were able to say if there's any particular project in the pipeline at present.
Yes, so I'm actually thinking of doing a gluten-free recipe book as well. And again, it's because I've been looking around again at some bookshops in all countries. Well, I travel quite a bit, and I just saw there's not a lot of solutions for different types of baking, which it's my passion. It's not just food, but baking per se is my passion, both savory and sweet. And I also noticed at cafes that there's not a lot of scope and not a lot of choices. It's just one or two, and sometimes the sweet things are overly sweet, and the savory are quite boring. And I also find that sometimes different types of gluten-free flours, that they just lump it together and use sometimes just one solution as a gluten-free flour for everything. And that is not possible. You don't create something like that. So that's in the pipeline for me, as well as a travel book as well. I travel quite extensively. And in there it won't just be about food. I'm also interested in architecture, history, cultures, traditions, that sort of thing, languages.
The niche has suddenly expanded.
Yes.
Well, let's get into our topic tonight. I'm just going to swap the layout so that we can actually have a few examples of what we're going to talk about in terms of creative process along the way. Now, this is the award-winning book, and the very first thing about this is you'd been researching, you'd been thinking about recipes, you've obviously been practicing recipes for a very long time because it's your passion.
Yes.
Was there a moment at which you actually thought to yourself, yes, I need to write all of this down and publish it?
Yes, it happened fairly early on. A few friends suggested that it's becoming such a thick, well, the manuscript or my papers or my notes, why don't I put that together in a recipe book? And then I thought that would actually be really nice, because I haven't seen anything that was available that I would buy. My mother was, for instance, a librarian, so from a very early age, I had a feel of what makes a good book, what doesn't, which book would you put down, which would you actually go through and read. So yes, I had all the pages, and when I started the process and into the creative process specifically, I just had my head down, and I just went from well, actually 3 years that it took me to write the recipe. So it's first year just to write the recipes, the second one to test it and fine tune it, the third one to take all the photographs. And I just knew it will be published.
Now, I think that's incredibly helpful for a first-time writer, author that wants to get something out there. That it's not a matter of sitting down and in a week or so churning out everything that's needed for a book. It doesn't work like that. You may actually get a whole lot of ideas down on paper, but there's a tremendous process or flow that must occur in order to go from A to Z. And I think the number A, if you like, point A is I need to publish it.
Yes.
Nothing will happen until you discover the inner need to say, I've got things to say that must be put out there for a wider audience.
I think so, because it's a sense of pride as well, because as you're busy into the process already and see where this is going and morphing into something more tangible, one feels that I would like to present this to a wider audience than just the immediate family members or so. So it's a satisfying process to see how it's developing from just sheer notes to manuscript, and eventually on your computer where you're editing it, and eventually it's 2 or 3 years. It's not uncommon. That's the usual sort of time frame if you're doing something that needed research as well. Eventually holding a physical book in your hands. Very satisfying.
Very satisfying and very difficult to achieve.
Yes.
It's not an easy thing to work from the idea
Yes.
or the concept through to the conclusion.
Oh yes, there's learning curves all the way from writing style to eventually your typesetting and setting the page as well. The photography I had to learn as well. I've never done food photography. It's a completely new area I had to explore as well. Yes.
When you just said food photography, I thought let's go into the title page of the book, and
Yes.
there's one of a splendid photograph. Festive occasion, or lots of red.
Yes.
Is that a Pahutakawa?
It's in fact yes, it is Putakawa. Yes, that's right.
Right.
It was during December that I did that. So with a red tablecloth, that sort of thing as well. So what you've just said is quite right. So there were some recipes that I did over for Easter. So I researched recipes that's from Poland to Germany. What would they serve for Easter? And some of the recipes are over 200 years old. For instance, I've got a Tuscan recipe that's over 250 years old. Wow. So then you would, for instance, when you do the photograph, would put that festive occasion in there just for a little bit of interest, because people would sometimes expect that to see the usual baking over Easter or Christmas, and sometimes for people who's gone vegan and looking for duplicating those recipes but in a vegan way, and then finding that it is possible. So it is important to link those together.
Laurinda, with that very old recipe, 250 years is quite a few generations. Has
Yes.
that been a family recipe that was handed down, or has it come in a different way?
It probably was a family recipe as well, but it was an Italian one, as I say, from Tuscany, and those recipes don't really change over time, so it's very traditional. It was in fact a recipe that I adapted it was boar. A recipe with different spices in it came through with different peoples that's gone through, and also the spices brought in. So then I just adapted that, but most of the recipes have been written purely from scratch. But some, as I said, research into ethnic cuisines just to make it interesting as well. Some of them are really old, and I wanted to go back to the original ones, not how it morphed over the years and changed its look completely.
It's not dissimilar to going into a supermarket or a fruit and vegetable shop today, and you'll see tomatoes that some are called heirloom
Yes.
tomatoes, and,
Yes.
and you know that you're getting something that's been produced for over a long period of time.
That's right.
And often those old varieties had qualities that are no longer there in the
That's
way
right.
that food is sort of mass produced today. And
yes.
well, Laurinda, we've had a viewer question come in, and it's really quite a fascinating one. It's asking how many books did you print and sell?
Right. My first run was 1,000 copies. That's obviously the most cost-effective way to do that, to print bulk. So I printed 1,000 through Hong Kong, and I sold those. It took me about 1.5 years to sell those. And in the meantime, I also went through, it's another company that in America, and I sold ebooks as well, and through Amazon and also the Apple Store.
Right. I think anyone that's serious about writing a book, whether it's fiction or a factual book, has to take into account the various formats now that you can output. As I've asked the question before in Kiwi Connection, Laurinda wouldn't have been part of the conversation, what is a book? And the conventional books that we all grew up with, yes, they're books, but there may be other ways of considering what a book is now. And so that whole marketing issue, we will come back and discuss a bit further. but 1,000 on a print run is very significant in New Zealand terms. I can't remember the statistics now, but I was talking to a South African guy who was a part of this congregation, and he wrote a number of military histories and similar things, and he had the statistics. If he could get sales of about 4,000 to 5,000, that was significant internationally.
Yes.
So we're used to thinking of, you know, Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code selling 1 million copies, but there are hardly any books in terms of the total number of books that are produced that achieve anything over 10,000.
Yes, I would say so. So anything above 2,000 copies sold is apparently New Zealand considered a bestseller.
Yeah. And it was very interesting when Stuart Mannins and I collaborated, and I produced the lead worship books in the Effective Church Leaders series. In the end, we never knew how many we actually sold, because we didn't sell them in that kind of way. Right. Some were free, some were part of courses, and etc. Yes. But the printer, who was Hannes Bierke's, he lost count. He didn't keep count, and he reckoned there were well over 2,000 of the lead worship books. Yes. The Effective Leaders, I think, was probably more like 300-400 copies. So we've got a number of published authors in here, and Stuart Mannins with his own SOMI books too, which were international bestsellers for early childhood music. Okay, Laurinda, I'm just wondering, you talked right at the start about a niche audience. Yes. You don't really get much more niche than vegan recipes, do you?
That's right. It's even a smaller market than your vegetarian section of any society. I think vegetarians, I saw a statistic once, is 7% of a population would be vegetarian, so vegan would be even smaller than that. So yes, it is small. It was at that stage quite a growing market as well. But in fact, that wasn't my market that I wanted to sell to specifically, because when I went, I already knew that, but when I, for instance, exhibited the book at various organic food shows, allergy shows, that sort of thing, it was in fact vegans who bought the book from me, because I knew they would already have their nutrition sorted out or have already food plans and meal plans for their families. People who came to me were in fact mothers who wanted to introduce their children to vegetables in interesting ways. So for instance, in my book, I've got beetroot baked into cakes, that sort of thing, or dips made out of vegetables. So that was something they were concerned with, that their children were not eating our vegetables. And the other market was just people who like to dabble in the kitchen and just wanted to make dishes more interesting as well, see the variety of vegetables, because one is busy. You want to have a meal on the table within half an hour or 40 minutes, and then one tends to land in a groove that you just make the same dishes over and over again with maybe a little bit of variation of flavors. So, and they came to me as well to see some other variations and completely new dishes, even reminding them of childhood dishes and interesting ethnic dishes. Many people have also traveled and wanted to see how they can make a dish vegan in a way that they were used to before when they were not vegan. So that was basically my market.
Well, I just took some photographs at random through the book that we've been looking at, and when you take these two pages side by side, everything that you were talking about there comes out in a both a graphic way as well as the text accompanying, obviously. What you've got there are some very attractive looking dishes with a remarkable set of colours in there. So the idea that this is that you've defined, that I said you defined your market as vegan, very niche, you've actually corrected that. These are vegan recipes, but not necessarily designed just for the vegan market.
That's right.
And that, I think, is a key thing, again, for someone hoping to get their book into print. if you don't have a clear idea about what audience you're writing for, well, I think few people will be interested. Here,
Yes.
what we're seeing is food presented, and everyone's got to live by cooking food.
Yes.
Food presented in a way that becomes attractive. Did you say vegetables attractive for children?
That's right. Because often with a book like this, it might be what's often called a coffee table book. Somebody would just like to page through. So I find that a lot as well when I had the books on the table as well. And friends of mine also said the same, that people who are not vegan would sometimes just page through it and just for enjoyment of just looking at the photographs, find enjoyment with the color, presentation as well, and just simply getting ideas. So one can use the same recipes, in fact, then put meat in it if one wants to do that, so it can go either way. It's quite versatile.
What a great idea. And now we're seeing the idea, the concept starts to crystallize out
Yes.
in a variety of ways. And in terms of this book, it won't be so for all books, but in terms of this book, you must have had a tremendous ride in terms of the creative process, because you're not simply outputting text, are you?
That's correct, yes. So it's a lot about writing a recipe in terms of balancing the nutrients in it as well. So that is something I would come forward with, and then there is research behind it, as I said. And then the day before I would photograph it, I would draw up, especially in the dessert section, draw up the way I would like to have it presented eventually on a photograph, where it's a side view or whether it's a face down one, or sort of blurring that one can focus just on one dish at a time or something like that. And then the photography was a tremendous learning curve for me, because I haven't had any training in food photography. In fact, I started to photograph some dishes first, and then started to look up a little bit of hints about it. And then I saw that I've already discovered that along the way by sheer creativity, that sort of thing, by just photographing oranges in a bowl, for instance, and seeing different aspects that you get, certain the color variation, also the light, the shadow effect, and also the size and how close you want to be with that. I didn't have any fancy camera equipment. It was a small Pentax camera. It had enough functions in it for me to have the various interesting photography potential in it as well, which makes it interesting. And of course, afterwards, you crop and edit and do that as well afterwards. So to get a variety of different photographs, because when people page through books, they don't want to have one boring photograph set in the same design setting in one way all the time. So I was very conscious of that as well. But I didn't have a special room to photograph it in, or a box. I know that people do that in a box with special lighting, sometimes actually lighting away from, because you cannot have lighting directly on food. That you cannot do at all. It becomes different colors in terms of whatever lenses you use. It sometimes maybe a slice of bread might look blue or green, which is quite horrible. So I just photographed it in a sunny room, and sometimes I saw on the lens that when the sun goes, it changes color in front of me. So it's important to take about 30 shots or so, and then look at a computer afterwards. And while the food, if it's still possible, go and check that, come back, photograph some more, and see what works and what doesn't.
Now, I think there's another really important principle that's emerged there. You need about 30 photographs minimum before you
Yes.
are able to choose the right one
Yes.
to work. But that's also true of doing the recipe itself. You don't do this recipe once, cook it and say that's it.
That's right.
You're using the recipe a number of times and refining it.
That's right.
Thinking it through.
That's right.
So now we've got two creative processes that are going on simultaneously. We've got the actual making the food, but now how are we going to display that food?
Yes.
And then in the background, how am I going to write about that recipe?
That's right. So often, well, not a lot of times, I would edit the recipe after the photograph. So I was very clear on what I wrote about, what I'm going to photograph afterwards as well. But it's important to, what I did, for instance, to do blank shots first, where you just photograph the plate first, and then, as I say, something else in it, like a small plum in it, just to see how that's going to look. But sometimes I had to redo a recipe, because funny enough, when you zoom in on certain dishes, for instance, if it is a stew dish that I wanted to have the colors to pop, to really come forward, then I would, for instance, just cook it halfway. And then when you really zoom in, you find that you don't display enough of all the ingredients to make it really feel that you see it as your eye would look at a plate at normal distance. So I would redo the recipe sometimes, and then cut the vegetables even smaller, or the nuts even smaller, and display it on a plate, literally this size. So this size, which is a dipping bowl. And then when you come really, really close to it, then it looks like a dinner plate. So there's all sorts of tricks one can do as well. If you want to have a close-up shot, but not of a dinner plate size, but small, that it looks big afterwards on the page.
Having talked about that part of the creative process and the sort of tricks and techniques and tips that you've got to do for the photography, I'm just going to look at this page in particular.
Yes.
You've also, when you've chosen your photographs and you've written up your recipes so that the steps are exact,
yes,
you then have to consider the layout of the page. Now, here we've got a number of different shaped bowls.
Yes.
So would it be fair to say that in terms of your creative processes, these needed to be in round plates, this needed in the end to be in a square plate, to get the pop of colour?
That's right. And the variety from page to page, as you page through, you don't get the sort of the same colour, the same dishes, the same decoration. And that is why I didn't write the recipes in chronological order. I jumped around. So I would, for instance, do and photograph, for instance, a soup, a dip, and maybe a dessert on the same day, and not 3 desserts or something like that, because you do tend to yourself fall into a rut and start to photograph things in the same way, present it.
Yeah, so when we're talking about 3 years from A to Z, there's a lot of things that go on in that 3 years.
That's right.
That it's not just a question of writing the recipe.
That's right. Sometimes one's mind does change in terms of what alternative sugars to use, because this recipe book doesn't use refined sugars, that sort of thing. This is not a gluten-free book, so I use different types of flours. Sometimes not everything is available in New Zealand, so what I did is then to give, not just in terms of variations, but also hints, how you can substitute different ingredients or flavors or whatever is also in season, but also ingredients that's not available, different flours, that sort of thing, just to make it easier and broader for people to use. Because sometimes if one reads a recipe and say, oh, well, there's 2 or 3 ingredients I don't have, then I won't make the entire dish then. So just to make it more accessible for people and for mothers on the run as well, to see, oh, well, I can see a hint there to how to quickly substitute things.
I'm not sure whether that's a hint, just to the right of that.
Yes.
Yeah, it is a hint.
Small, yes.
And we can see that on my mouse on the screen, but it doesn't show up in the recording. But that hint will be printed in a different font size.
That's right.
And so another part of the creative process that you've had to work through, and it comes relatively, not towards the end, it comes before then. What fonts am I going to use in order that this will be a very readable book? Typography plays a key role.
Yes.
Recipe title. And the hints, how does the eye get led to a hint? Because there's a lot of visual information on this page.
That's correct. So one needs to guard against it, especially in terms of a recipe book, that your page doesn't get too busy. It's all very interesting for maybe if a person looks at a few pages, but 1 or 2 pages, and that interest is there in terms of, wow, this looks interesting, it's colorful. But then in your mind, you suddenly almost start to tire, because it feels it's too much going on. I can't pay too much attention anymore. So what I did is, for the title, I used almost a decorative font that was papyrus, and then for the rest I used Helvetica, and then for the font sizes I just made it smaller. So for the hints that is really small, for variations I put weight in it, so that was bold print. And just for a bit of playfulness, because sometimes people get bogged down with all the steps, I use the numbering for the steps. I use that just in a light different color, light green. But apart from that, I wanted to keep it not as busy, because it's too much with a photograph there as well.
Yeah, what we've got in these facing pages is quite a calming influence. Yeah, the text is,
yes.
The visual hierarchy, if you like, is very clear. The photograph just sits there very nicely, very, very well done. And so book production is, for authors that are going to be self-publishers, book production is actually a very significant part of the process. And it's usually at the book production level that a decision has to be made. Am I going to continue to run this project for myself, or am I going to hand it over to a publisher? Now, there are many great publishers. In Kiwi Connection, we've got a special connection with PGPL, Philip Garside Press, and Philip works a lot with authors that are, they don't necessarily know that they've got a market that's going to buy. So that kind of publisher is very, very helpful. For Laurinda and myself, we've gone, through the whole process, and from idea, designing it, getting it out, all the visual elements, etc. But then we come to this question: we've done it. How are we going to market it? And there we have quite divergent paths. So let's hear your path for marketing, Laurinda.
Yes, certainly if one goes to a publisher, what I did is to target publishers that would, for instance, publish and market things and books that's in a direction of lifestyle or diet or healthy eating, something like that. So it's not going to help to target publishers that's not in that direction, because that's not their thrust, that's not what they know, not the context they've got as well. So certainly, from a marketing point of view, one has to be very clear on who possibly can be your market and your audience, and then broadening just a little bit. So what I did, for instance, first of all is, of course, you get an ISBN number here at the back. So that's the first thing that I did here in New Zealand when I was just still editing on my computer, and you can get that through the National Library. And then what's picked up from there, other libraries will then see there's a new book that's been registered. Of course, you do give 6 copies of the book to the library. They keep it as copies. Anything that's printed in New Zealand is kept there as well. And then libraries would approach one, and then it's also very good if one is in the writing process to, especially someone like myself, this was my first book. I also joined the Writers Association in New Zealand, because they give one a lot of help, especially your legal rights. I, for instance, went to them with some legal issues and questions, and they offer that service for free. And then also your public lending right to libraries, so they also offered advice there. But also just to go along to the evenings to hear what other writers have done, successes they had, failures, to see what works, what doesn't work, and then speakers who came, some well-known authors in New Zealand came to speak. And that was invaluable also to see the process, and maybe a little bit of a calming effort as well, effect to see that one is on the right track, others have done it. That's very valuable. And then, of course, if you go through a publisher, they do all the marketing, wonderful, but they may also change your title, they may change a significant part of the book, which is not nice always. So one may go headlong in a direction. Maybe stubbornly, one keeps your title that maybe the publisher was thrown out, that sort of thing. So, but I would say go along with one's passion, go along with your gut feeling in terms of where you think the market should be. So it would be a variety of ways. It would be a lot of footwork to go to bookshops, present it, speak to the person who does the actual book buying. I, for instance, went to all the organic shops in New Zealand. They all stocked my book as well. All the bookshops did as well, the big and the small family-run ones as well. And then do exhibitions. I did, for instance, a lot of cooking classes, both at shows, at organic shops, at home, set it up. That's fun. It's enormous fun. I love it. You meet a lot of interesting people. As I said, the libraries are a good option as well. And then internationally, I also joined the Vegan Society of the UK. Eventually, they approached me and asked that I write 6 recipes, starters, which can be used as small dishes, 6 mains and 6 desserts that's going to be used in all the hospitals in the UK as a vegan option for their patients. So that's what they did as well.
Well, I think that's a fantastic summary of the effort that's required in marketing. Now, Laurinda has taken a huge project and turned it from concept into reality, into that printed book, and as we heard, she's working on a few more. I wouldn't want people that are budding authors to be put off by thinking that they don't have such a massive project to do, because to get published, you could be just talking about a 10-page little local history, a family history,
Yes.
etc.
Yes.
And you will find that there are some niche publishers that will help you to
Yes.
get that
Yes.
into print. And we wouldn't want to neglect the online component of marketing. That's through Amazon,
right.
Kindle, all of those kinds of things. But maybe that's a separate story from what we're talking about here, which is a highly successful print run. Our message, I think, Laurinda, to anyone that watches this, and we will be promoting it on YouTube, is have a go. Think of it as 3 stages. Think of it, your concept, and where you start to think about who you're writing for, the production of it, which includes the text and may include some
That's
graphics,
right.
and finally, the effort that you're going to put into marketing, because the vast majority of books that are produced require the author to do some quite strong legwork, taking it round and
That's right.
being unafraid to say, hey, we think you might be interested in this. Thank you very much for joining me, and we'll say good evening for everyone.
Good evening.